Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to the corridors of power. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Today, is it another Rishi reset?
Now, I feel a profound sense of urgency because more will change in the next 5 years than in the last 30. I'm convinced that the next few years will be some of the most dangerous, yet the most transformational that our country has ever known. So the question we face today is this: who has the clear plan and bold ideas to deliver a secure future for you and your family?
That's the Prime Minister speaking earlier, making his pitch to frame the general election debate around national security. Of course, this comes after the party's major losses in the local elections and the defection of Natalie Elphicke to Labour.
Look, it's easy to do this when you're the incumbent government, to play on the foreign enemies, the fear of foreign enemies in the run-up to an election. It's a classic play, isn't it, electorally? But he's also milking the pledge he's already made to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, which, bear in mind, was another item of Keir Starmer's clothing that he stole, although Labour never put a time frame on that commitment. But that said, Stephen, this is a trend around the world. We are arguably in a more hostile world. The European Union just announced a couple of months ago it's setting aside an initial €1.5 billion to bolster its defence industry. Bloomberg's own reporting just last month uncovered the $10 trillion rearming reckoning that faces the US. And if they want to compete with the militaries of Russia and China, you could argue that that's necessary. So maybe it's not original, but Sunak is pulling in the same direction as his international peers.
Yeah, and look, he's also trying to take control of a narrative that seems to have sort of escaped him on so many issues, which he's thought of as being core to not only his personal branding, but also the Tory message involved here as well. And if you look at the latest YouGov polling on who voters actually trust when it comes to defence, the Tories' ratings have been on a fairly significant slide since back in 2020, over 40% now, just 22% of voters trust the Tories, and that puts them within a hair's breadth of Labour because they actually come in at 20% on that survey as well, and that's a rating that has been moving upwards as well. This is a difficult battle for Rishi Sunak to win, and he's trying to put his stake in the ground with this speech.
And it's interesting on a personal level. It's interesting that you pull out that date 2020 because who is in number 10 at that point? Boris Johnson. Who is phenomenally popular in Ukraine? Boris Johnson, for his early response to Russia's invasion there. Many would point to his, and I say this with a smile, attempt to do a Churchill, his idol of history in the Conservative Party. You have to ask, realistically, can Rishi Sunak pull that off? I think many in the population, correct me if I'm wrong, but think of Rishi Sunak as the Chancellor who delivered furlough. And can he recast himself in the limited amount of time before the election as the war Prime Minister who is going to be strong on all of Britain's foreign enemies?
Well, it's a big pitch to make. Let's dig into some of the details of the challenges the Prime Minister is talking about. Joining us now for more is Samir Puri, who is Associate Fellow at Chatham House and a visiting lecturer in the War Studies Department at King's College London. Samir, great to have you with us on the programme. We can see the potential political gain for a politician to make a speech like the one Rishi Sunak is making today, warning of profound urgency. Is he right, though? Is the world that much more a dangerous place?
Well, thanks very much for having me. It is. I think the question, though, is what Britain can actually do about it. And I think the speech today is following on from his speech in Warsaw just a few weeks ago, where he described an axis of authoritarian states that are working much more closely together. And that's how he described the worsening security situation in the world. But I think sort of beyond that, there's the obvious points of the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. There is still a question of what Britain can do about it, given that the increase in its defence budget is going to be quite a difficult thing to push forward and maintain, given the fact we have an election coming up as well.
Yeah, I want to come on to the money and how to spend it in a bit, but if we can just focus on what that threat actually is. You mentioned the Axis. Which front is most dangerous for the UK? The war, as you mentioned, in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, the South China Sea. What about Africa?
Yeah, unquestionably, it's the war in Ukraine, it's European security, which also Britain has got, as well as the security side of supporting Ukraine. And this war in Ukraine is clearly going to go on for for quite some time is going to be a big drain on Ukraine's supporters. Even the USA, which has uncertain political consensus around supporting Ukraine. But the real fact of the matter is that in the Middle East and in the South China Sea, the UK has got two very different engagements. In the Middle East, it is engaged in Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is the joint operation led by the Americans against the Houthis, who are backed by Iran. But in the South China Sea, the UK, there's no conflict that's active there. And it's really, I think, a statement of intent from the UK to be able to sail its ships through the South China Sea as it has done in the past. So I think in order of importance, clearly Europe and Ukraine is the most important. Then there's a significant drop. Then there's the Middle East. And then there's a significant drop still before you get to South China Sea. And as you rightly pointed out, although there's no sudden need for the UK to deploy its military into Africa at this moment, one cannot foreclose the possibility of a humanitarian crisis or some kind of civil conflict that could erupt, that could draw the UK in years to come.
Yeah, because Africa is certainly an area where Russia has been targeting its attentions. But you mentioned the US. I wonder, does the UK have to prioritise the theatres that are prioritised by America?
Quite the opposite, actually. And I think I was actually once at a lecture with Lloyd Austin, the US Defence Secretary, and one of my former colleagues asked him, isn't it great that the UK sailed their aircraft carrier to the South China Sea? As on the record remarks, Lloyd Austin more or less said the UK should focus on European security. And that's been something that some American policymakers have said, which is, while it's very nice that the UK has this sort of moral contribution to security in the Asia Pacific, actually what the US probably wants is its European partners and allies, the UK foremost among them, to really take up some of that burden of not only supporting Ukraine, but building up the deterrence in Eastern NATO states, the Eastern European NATO states. So I think quite the opposite. And just one closing comment on that. I think for some UK policymakers who have very closely clung to the Atlanticist notion that you partner with America, you follow America, as has been the case since the end of the Cold War, and in the Cold War as well, there's a bit of unlearning of that to go down your own route. And your own route is actually, as the Americans become increasingly obsessed and occupied with their challenge, facing the challenge that they see of China and China's challenge against America's position in the Asia Pacific, we have to remember in the UK that we don't have any geographic connection to the Pacific Ocean. The Americans are a Pacific power. The UK has a historic, going back to the imperial era, connection and indeed equities in parts of Southeast Asia and South Asia. But it's a big question as to whether the UK can sustain a very active engagement in the Asia Pacific in the 2020s and 2030s when there's a war raging in Europe, and the Americans themselves are saying, Europeans, you have to pick up the slack on European security.
Will increasing spending from 2% of GDP to 2.5% of GDP really make a difference? Will it protect the UK better than it is now?
I mean, any increase is welcome. I'm certainly a big supporter of it. And I think most people involved in sort of national security policy making and analysis would say you've got to do it because the peace dividend after the Cold War set the UK's defence budget on a somewhat downward trajectory, more or less, since the 1990s. And picking that back up, given the nature of the global security environment, it's got to be done. What difference will it make? Well, in Warsaw, the previous speech by Rishi Sunak, so three big priorities, Ukraine, Russia clearly being one of them, but others involved things like force modernization. And that, I think, is where, when we're talking about will it make the UK more secure, clearly the Russia-Ukraine war has left a lot of lessons for every military force around the world around the utility of things like main battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, manned fighter aircraft. So there's a big aspect of modernizing the UK's military, which is essential for it to be useful.
Well, is this enough then? Is 2.5% enough? Do we need to be much bolder about our commitments to defence spending?
I would say so. And I think 3% is something that Poland, for example, has called for its NATO allies to head towards. But I think with the UK, and again with this general election coming up, there's an enormous, I think, question mark over political will and consistency of commitment over the next 4 or 5 years. And I think 2.5% by Sunak is a very, very welcome, very bold step. And it does somewhat throw down the gauntlet to Labour, thinking about 2025 if they're in power, which is very likely, to match that. And also just to create, I think, a greater sense within the British defence industry that there is commitment from Downing Street and from the political side of things to actually increase defence spending. Because a quick closing comment on this, it's easy to find the headline figures as yet another thing to think about industry and what it needs to actually plan for the future, to set up those production lines, to increase production lines, to increase the numbers of certain classes of naval vessels or
should the argument then be economic as well, that in fact spending this money is going to produce an economic dividend?
Yes, and I do wonder why that argument isn't made more visibly, because even support to Ukraine very often is actually money spent in the supporting country, not just gifted, in the supporting country to build new weapon systems, defensive systems that are then either gifted to Ukraine or used to replace what you're gifting to Ukraine. So I agree with you, and I think from a domestic sort of communication perspective, more could be made of that, I think.
Well, I wonder whether the reason they don't make that argument is because it would be seen as callous, and whether politicians have the appetite to lose soldiers' lives in these conflicts, or whether that's still, post-Iraq and Afghanistan, political suicide. That's
a really important point, and it reminds me that at the start of Russia's all-out invasion, just over 2 years ago, all Western policymakers, UK included, ruled out sending their troops to fight with Ukrainians shoulder to shoulder. And I think a lot of that's to do with escalation with Russia. A lot of it's also to do with the legacy of Iraq and Afghanistan, which were draining conflicts that had very, very disappointing and arguably disastrous ends as well. And so there's a generation of policymakers and indeed veterans who are, some of which occupy very important positions in government and in industry. Everyone has got to, I think, live with that legacy for a little bit longer. But then there's the final observation, which is, what could the UK do in direct conflict with any of this axis of authoritarian states? Even the Americans are not looking for a World War III. So the question with this increase in defence budget in relation to this background of this worsening security situation is still ultimately deterrence. Okay. It's building up the UK's forces so they can present a strong contribution to deterring future conflicts.
Okay, Samir, great to have you with us in the programme. Samir Puri there, Associate Fellow at Chatham House. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.